Hey friends, well, greetings from Tegama. Been at this for a while today. It hasn't gone very smoothly, but hey, listen, it's the 13th day of the quarantine, and it's been another dark day in terms of news. 27 have died from the virus in our little province, and across the country of Spain it's been 770, basically 769 in the last 24 hours. That's another horrible record. And then there's 25,000 officially have died across the worldwide, and we know it's way more than that. Those are just the official numbers. And among the dead here in the country of Spain are nurses and doctors, emergency workers, and the virus has affected politicians, musicians, sportsmen. Even the royal family has been touched, and so it's a big deal, and we don't know, where it's going to go, how much more the Lord's going to allow to happen, but we are looking to Him and trusting in Him. And so now I want to turn to the Bible. Obviously, there are not very many quarantine stories in the Bible, and we've seen several of them, and I'm turning more towards those stories that are more of an isolation kind of scenario, where either God isolates a person or a person self-isolates or self-quarantines, or whatever you'd want to say. That's going to be sort of the situation today. And so anyway, that's what I'd like to focus today on, the lady, on the woman called Elizabeth. And you know her, probably know her story well. But it's in the book of Luke, chapter 1. I want to read a few verses and then make some observations and so forth. Luke 1:5, there was in the days of Herod, the king of Judea, a certain priest named Zachariah, of the course of Abiah, and his wife was of the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. So they were both from priestly families, and they were both righteous before God, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord, blameless. And they had no child, because that Elizabeth was barren, and they both were now well stricken in years. So they were well past the age of bearing. And then 24 and 25, and after those days his wife Elizabeth conceived and hid herself 5 months. There's our connection to this theme, saying, Thus hath the Lord dealt with me in the days wherein he looked on me, to take away my reproach among men. And then in verse 41, and it came to pass that when Elizabeth heard the salutation of Mary, the babe leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Ghost. Okay, so this Elizabeth, first of all, she's a godly woman from a very good family, but she's a woman of unusual faith. I hadn't even noticed this as much before as when I started preparing this devotional. And I think because she had that unusual faith, God decided to honor her and give us her story. And most of her story is in Luke chapter 1. Now, they were elderly, at least past the stage of bearing children. And that, in that culture, was a sign, for many people, it was a sign of God's disfavor, of His judgment. And there are passages in the Old Testament that would give a little bit of basis for that, like Abraham and Abimelech. There's a story there. There's Saul's daughter Michal. But there are many, many cases where it wasn't that. Rather, the barrenness was often a platform for God to show His glory and His power. And that's what happened with Elizabeth. Her husband was burning incense, the story goes, and that was an unusual privilege, because he was as a priest, he would normally be at the temple twice a year to serve in the temple, but very rarely was a priest given the opportunity or the privilege of burning the incense right before the veil. And so that would never have happened to him before, would never have happened again for sure. And that's when God chose to send Gabriel, the angel, to tell him that the prayers were answered. They were still praying, apparently. Their prayers were answered, and they were going to have a son. And so that's what happened. Well, Elizabeth gets pregnant, And then she makes a very interesting and personal decision, nothing like it anywhere in the Bible that I can think of. She decides to stay away from public light for 5 months. And so we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Why might she have done that? Another interesting thing is that God honored her decision. That 5-month period, God honored it, because when he came to talk to Mary, he waited until those 5 months were over, and he talked to her in the 6th month and told her that Elizabeth was pregnant. And then, adding to that, then he had, Mary anyway, went and visited Elizabeth to be a blessing to her. So God honored that 5-month decision that she had. And then, of course, later, Elizabeth, with unusual insight, because the Holy Spirit gave her the understanding, she gave a beautiful tribute to the divine baby who was inside of Mary, as well as a tribute to Mary and her testimony and the fact that God had chosen her for this very special thing. But she was also an encouragement. So, some observations and practical lessons for us from this period. First of all, thinking about that 5-month isolation. Why would she have done that? And maybe you can come up with some other reasons, but I came up with a few, at least, that satisfy my curiosity, and I think they were involved in it. Taking into consideration that she was a faithful, godly woman, these would be consistent with that. First of all, it was an expression of gratitude. It was a way of saying, Lord, thank you for this gift, this miracle of a son in this way. In our time of quarantine or isolation, maybe a time without a job could be considered something like that. When God brings these things to our lives, how important that in them we decide this is going to be a time to thank God for his goodness to me. I don't know exactly what he has in mind, but I can follow the example of a godly woman as well and be grateful to God. And that's what apparently she said. She even mentioned the fact that he had taken away her reproach. So there was this reproach that was thrown at her or heaped on her. Okay, so first of all, expression of gratitude. It was also a time of devotion. She gave 5 months to not being out, but to be alone with God. And I'm sure to get to know the Lord better, to honor him with that time, that special time. Now, in this particular situation of quarantine, even in our church family, there are a number of families where it's not a quiet time. It's not a time of isolation. I mean, it's isolated from the outside world, but in the home there are children, 1, 2, 3 children, and it's hard to keep them. They have to stay in the house. They cannot go out. And so to keep them entertained and to keep them quiet and keep everybody sane in the house, it's not an easy thing. That's a complicated thing. I can hardly imagine how it is after 13 days. And so God needs to give wisdom. We need to look to God for wisdom, if that's our situation, to make this time a very special time of devotion to God, but also of devotion to our family, to our children. It's a time when God has made us be together in ways that are not normally the case. And so those of you who are in that kind of situation or will be in that kind of situation, make that time, not 5 months. I hope we're not 5 months in this situation, but whatever it is that God does, however long it happens and God makes it be, that it be a special time for family or whoever is with you of getting to know God. So it was a time of special devotion. It was a time was an expression of gratitude. And then third, I think it was a sign or maybe an expression as well, an expression of humility, and that would be consistent with her character as a godly woman. what would the natural inclination be? After years of reproach, after remember the story of Samuel's mother Anna and Penina. After years, Elizabeth, of knowing that people saw her and thought of her as being judged by God, the natural thing would be to show it off, to show off the bump, the growing bump, you know, and just let them know that they were wrong, you know, and God has done something wonderful in me. There's a miracle growing inside of me, etc., etc. And she didn't do that. She decided she would be reserved. She would keep it to herself. She would not gloat over it. I think it was a step of humility, and a powerful one. And so that's something we can as well remember, that should characterize us, is the humility. Even though we know maybe way more than other people who are just simply victims in the crisis and they don't know God, they don't understand what's happening. We do, but we need to be careful at how we express that and what our attitude is. God used her to bless Mary. When Mary came to be a blessing, I'm sure Mary came to be a blessing to her, the first thing that happened was Elizabeth was a blessing to Mary. And that's what we want to do. We want to be a blessing to people during the quarantine, whether it's to our children, whether it's people outside, whether we use electronic means or whatever. Everyone has a different opportunity and different options to be a blessing. When Mary got there, Elizabeth gave a beautiful tribute to the divine baby in there, and also to Mary as well for her testimony and her godly testimony, and God had chosen her. It was just a time of encouraging Mary, who was in a very difficult and embarrassing situation, complicated because she was pregnant and she wasn't married, and this was a very difficult thing to handle. And so Elizabeth was an instrument of God to her, and that's what we want to be in the times of quarantine or these isolation scenarios, to be a blessing. So finally, as to wrap it up, Elizabeth's barrenness not only was it not a judgment from God or a sign of his disfavor, it actually had a reason. It had a purpose. There was God, for all of those years, he was, in a sense, saying, Zachariah and Elizabeth, hang in there. Trust me. Wait. I'm going to do something. Just keep praying, keep trusting, keep waiting. I'm going to show you my glory. And did he ever do it? And so I want to end with the verse, let's see, verse 36 and 37. And behold, this is the angel talking to Mary. And behold, thy cousin Elizabeth, she hath also conceived a son in her old age. And this is the 6th month with her, who was called barren. It's a reproach. They were talking about her. It says, this is the 6th month with her. For with God, nothing shall be impossible. These are times when God will show us his glory. Are you maybe going to lose your job? Are you going to be really hard hit because of the crisis? Because you're not able to work, or whatever? That could be something that happens, or even losing a family member, difficult, dark times. Wait on the Lord. He will show his glory. We need to be alert and alive to see what he will do. May we follow her example in honoring God. May God bless you and have a great day. Goodbye.